Well, okay, then we're going to continue on with our quest to cover all of the new features that are in Simplify 3D version 4 and see, exactly what they do in the hope that proves useful. So yeah, let's have a look at the feature that we're going to be covering today. So in the last video, we looked at the multi-process vars mode. So moving on to the next new feature in Simplify 3D version 4 is the external fill customization. Now basically what this means is you can define exactly the angles which the external fills, i.e. the external top and bottom solid layers, you can define the angle in which they're printed. Now what Simplify 3D say here is that this is both for, or could be both for, aesthetic and structural purposes. One additional thing that I'm interested in seeing is if by controlling the angle of these layers you can prevent the surfaces, the top layers specifically, or bottom layers possibly, from splitting the order in which they're printed. Now this is a bit tricky to explain, but essentially what happens is I've seen in a number of prints where it comes across the top layers doing the infill, and then for sort of geometric reasons it hops off and does a top layer somewhere else and then comes back to fill in to where it had been working before, and you see quite a significant change in the surface area, and this is visible in final print. Unfortunately, they don't seem to have added a feature specifically to deal with this, but I'm wondering if you can do it by forcing the angle that the external fill layers are printed in. So let's jump into the software and take a look. So I've created a model here to demonstrate these external fill customizations, and the reason why I've done it like this is because it's relatively long and thin, and as you can see, one section of it, the top layers are slightly above the rest of them, about 1.5 mil in fact above these top layers here. Now if we go to prepare the print just on a straight normal version 3 nothing changed process, you can see, let's zoom in, how it's dealt with the top layer infills. You can see that they are basically zagging this way all the way along, so they are pretty much on that part at least all in the same direction. If we then come to this area here, you can see that because it's moved up a few layers, that it's doing that in a different direction. Now if we wished for them all to be, in the same direction, there's nothing much that we can do about that in version 3, as we have no control over the direction that these are printed in. In this case, it would only really be for aesthetic purposes that we'd want the infill on this top solid layer to run in the same direction as these, but however, that is something that we may want to do. In my case, I'm going to spice this up a little bit by saying actually I want my top fill layers to run directly this way for structural purposes. So if we jump into SolidWorks for a minute and have a look at the actual part, how it might be used, we can see that I'm running a simulation here showing the stresses of this part if this end of it is anchored to another body and a load is applied to this end here. Now ignoring for a minute the actual stresses, because in the design there is actually a stress riser built in, which you can see here, which is going to be the point of failure probably. However, the important point is that this is flexing along this way, so we want the most strength in this direction. And as a 3D printed part is more likely to fail in the areas where the filament bonds together rather than running with the filament, it will be better for us to run the external top layers in this direction. So let's hop back into Simplify 3D. We can see that the top layers are basically not that bad. They are running at an angle, which means that the stresses won't be entirely on the bonding between these particular runs of filament. But that really is the luck of the draw in version 3. You don't really have any control over the angles that they are going to be printed. So that, let's say if we go down to the layer before this, you can see that actually this part here really is running in the, well, perpendicular to the most stress on this part. So it's most likely to fail where the filament bonds together. So ideally what we'd want to do is to run these surface layers where the filament runs actually along this structure, and this is something that we can now do in version 4. So let's take a look at version 4. So here we are, let's open up the process settings, and these new options that you've got in version 4 to adjust the external infill layer angle is in, curiously, the infill tab in version 4's settings window. So basically if we compare this with version 3's infill, there we go, we can see that this general side has remained unchanged, and on the right side of this tab, before we only had control over the infill angle offsets, which we still do, but we've also got external infill angle offsets. Now, to my mind, this is sort of slightly confusing because I don't really consider the top solid layers and bottom solid layers as infill, but anyway, that's how they're describing it. So we've always had the ability, as you can see, in version 3 and version 4, to define the angle of the, well, the structural infill, what takes up the area in between the solid bottom and top layers. But what they've added now in version 4 is the ability to control the angle of those actual top and bottom solid layers. So this is a new feature. So what we're going to do is we'll get rid of the version 3 one for a minute, and this is how it would come out. By default you'd have 45 minus 45 both on the internal and external angles. So this should be fairly much as version 3 would have been. So let's OK that, and let's do a preview. Let's zoom in a little bit, and we can see that although the angles are somewhat different to version 3, yeah, it's still deciding how it's going to do it. Well, it's not deciding, it's doing it at 45 degrees and then minus 45 degrees. So what that means is, and if we go back by layer and let's go down to here, we should see that the first solid top layer has an angle of 45 degrees, and there is that. And that is 45 degrees from this way here, so that they are at 45 degrees going that way. The next layer will be at minus 45 degrees. And there you go. So it's got a 90-degree difference between it. Now, before we move on to actually forcing it to print the top layers the way that we want them, I want to show you what I mean about the order in which the infill is printed. So I'm going to take it back to a point where it's just about to print the top layer of these infills here. Right, here we are. So I'm going to zoom in on this area here. Now you can see that it's just starting to do these infills. Now it started here for some reason rather than starting over here. And if we play it forwards a little bit slowly, line by line, you can see that it's doing the infill here. Yep, no problem. Then it's going to move across to this area here. But what it's going to do now, you see there is potentially an issue in the surface. Just this is purely aesthetic, but what's happened is that it's printed this section here, and then it's hopped over and it's doing around here, and then it's going to come back and fill this in here. Now what I've seen in reality is that what you get is quite a different surface finish between the bit that was printed first here and the bit that it's about to print here. Now really it's no big deal, and like I said, it's purely aesthetic, but I'd like to be able to see if I can also get rid of that, I wouldn't call it an issue, but that phenomenon with forcing the print layers. Anyway, let's zoom out a bit and go back up to the top, and you can see that these are printed at a different angle. So let's go back in and actually start playing with these new settings. Okay, so edit the process settings and go to the infill tab. And so let's remove the angles that are set in Simplify3D, like so. and I'm going to put in 0 and 90 as my external infill angle offsets. And we'll go back into prepare the print, and you can see that it is exactly 90 degrees out. That is the worst case scenario, but it has done those quite nicely up there. So what you can see is that although we can set this, it's not necessarily going to print these in the same order, and the reason is because it cycles between those. So what if I change this to layer? Let's say that this is running at 0 degrees. It means that the top layer below that will be 90, 0, 90, 0, 90, 0, 90, 0, 90, 0, and you can see it just goes from one to another. It really depends on what the difference in height is between your actual top layers on whether they're going to be aligned or not. So let's see what we can do to fix these things. Let's jump back out, go into the process settings, go back into the infill tab, and let's remove that, and let's add in 0 afterwards. Let's leave it like that for a minute and go back in to prepare the print. And you can see that that has successfully now given us what we want, with the infill running with our direction of stress essentially. But it hasn't fixed this yet. So let's jump back out, go back in again into the infill tab, and let's add in another 90 degree here. So what that means is it's going to go with the first top layer, it's going to be 90, the second will be 0, the third will be 90, the fourth will be 90, and then 0, and so on. So let's jump in here and prepare the print, and we can now see that yeah, it's gone completely wrong, but they are both in the same direction. So let's go back out, edit the process settings once again, go back in here. So let's remove all of these, and let's start off with 0, and then 90, and then 0. And let's go back in and preview again, and there you go. You can see that we have where we want the filament running in line with the flex or the stress of this part. It is doing that, and it has also now got the same direction on this top layer here. Now let's skip back and see if it is going to print all of these top layers at the same time, i.e. there's going to be no movement around somewhere else whilst it does these relatively large sort of solid areas here. Again, only for aesthetics, but let's see if it fixes it. Righto, so I've gone back and got it to a point where it's just starting to print what would be the final top layer in this area here, and it's doing these infill areas. So let's slow it down slightly and play it, and you can see it's doing that in one sweep, it's doing that in one sweep, it's doing that in one sweep, and yep, it's doing that one in one sweep as well. So let's see, I'm going to run a print both with, I'm not going to bother doing version 3 because, well, we can see what we just can't do this in version 3. But I'm going to print 2 prints from version 4, one with the defaults, i.e. 4545, and we'll see if we get any, let's call them artifacts, where it's printing, this area down here in sort of 2 different times. And also to see the a print where we've got our custom angles. I'm not going to be going as far as testing the difference in strength because that's probably really not that applicable anyway, but yeah, here we go then. Okay, then the prints are complete. Both of these were done from version 4. The one on the right, this one here, was done without any particular care taken on the angle of the external infill layers, and as you can probably see, if that focuses, they are at different angles. So we've got a different angle on the infill going on here to that which we have going on around here. Ignore for a minute the gaps in there because I didn't have any gap fill settings applied to this process, so yeah, we've got a few gaps, but that is not the subject of this video. Now, I had tried to include what happens, what sort of artifacts you get If you remember in the print preview, when it comes to this, doing this, is that focused? I think so. When it comes to doing this area of external infill up here, it runs in, does that, then hops, wiggles its way around the outside here, and then continues it on. And you can see a slight artifact, well, at least I can see a slight artifact here where it then comes back and joins up to the infill it had already done. This isn't a particularly great example of that because it's quite a small section, and I have figured out since anyway exactly what causes this and why it isn't an issue in Slicer. So yeah, that's kind of not really within the scope of this video, so I'm going to do a separate video on this, and I think, yeah, well, I know why it does it, and I think it would be a nice option in Simplify3D to prevent that happening. But again, that's going to be the subject of another video. So let's have a look at the one where we used our custom external infill angles, and you can probably see that all of the infill angles on this top here are all running from, well, in this case, left to right as we look at it. So you can see that the infill angle is running straight across that way on this part of the print and also on this part of the print. And that is the feature that we've been looking at in this particular video. Yeah, so I think that about does it for now. Let's go back up top. So there it is. Yep, it does pretty much what it says. How useful that is, well, like most of the rest of these features, that's going to depend on you really. Whether or not being able to align the external fill layers according to what you want is actually going to prove any real world difference in strength, not sure. You'd probably be better off, well, obviously you're going to have to change the infill directions as well, and I think that's probably going to, you know, have a bigger bearing on how strong the part is. From an aesthetics point of view, yeah, definitely, if that's, you know, something that you need to make the external thing look a bit better, then yeah, it's going to do that. So if we look at Simplify3D's website with their version 4 What's New page, the only two items left here are the new improved mesh reduction feature, which I'm not really going to cover because I don't use Simplify3D for any kind of mesh work whatsoever. Been using Mesh Mixer now for quite a long time, and it's more of a dedicated tool for that kind of thing, so I just don't really bother looking at it. The other box there is, yeah, and many more. Well, that doesn't really give me anything to work on, so I don't know what those new features are or bug fixes are. Yeah, probably just general under the hood improvements. So looking back on what we've done here over the past videos, we've covered pretty much all of the new features that they list on the website here, apart from the ones that require, you know, multiple media or multiple extruders, which I don't have the capability for. So yeah, we have come to the end of this series of videos. In summary, all of the features I've looked at do provide noticeable improvements and sort of achieve what, you know, what they advertise there on the website. How useful they are to you is going to depend exactly on how you use 3D printing and, you know, the slicer, and also the kind of parts you are printing. For me personally, I think, you know, out of all these new options, probably the bridging might prove useful, the breakaway rafts occasionally, the external infill angles occasionally. Nothing else is really sticking out to me as something that's really going to, you know, change things a lot for me. But I hope these videos have proved useful to anybody that's watched them or will watch them in the future. And hopefully next time I'll get a bit ahead of the game for version 5 and start doing the what's new in version 5 videos actually closer to when version 5 comes out. So talking about version 5, there are a few things that I would have rather have seen changed or updated or brought into version 4 than the features they chose to. Now, of course, I doubt very much that anybody from Simplify3D is ever going to see this, but I'm going to do a few videos coming up now on some of the things I would like personally to see in version 5, would have liked to see in version 4, would like to be in Simplify3D generally speaking. So we're going to get to those in a bit, but I'm going to have a slight break from Simplify3D for a couple of 3 videos just to mix things up a little bit. I spent a lot of time in Simplify 3D recently, and I'm going to sort of turn my attention to doing a couple of videos on subjects which have been brought up by some of my subscribers, mostly in emails to me directly from the website. So yeah, there's definitely at least a couple of subjects that I want to get videos done on those, and they will be coming very soon.